On behalf of Asia Society Northern California and Seattle, welcome to our event on navigating Asian American perspectives on affirmative action. We have a terrific lineup of speakers for you on a very timely topic. Our mission at Asia Society is to build bridges and navigate shared futures. We embrace tough topics in a challenging world, and we also embrace diverse points of view. We anticipate lots of that today, and we really look forward to all of your participation. I'm Margaret Conley, the Executive Director of Asia Society Northern California and Seattle. All of our speaker bios are on both of our websites. For our format, we'll do this event in two parts. First, we'll hear a presentation from Neil Ruiz, the head of new research initiatives at the Pew Research Center. Then we'll have a panel discussion with 4 expert speakers. At the end of each session, there will be time for Q&A from the audience. If you have a question, type it in the Q&A box and we'll be monitoring them throughout the program. This event is on the record and we are recording. This video will be posted on our website. We have until 3:30 Pacific for this program. We have a hard stop at 3:30, so please do get your questions in early. Let's go ahead and get started with Neil Ruiz. Thank you very much for being here. Neil.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for having me, and I'm glad to be back here at Asia Society, this time virtually. So first off, I'm going to do, and everyone see this? Yes. So I'm going to go through a presentation of work that we've done at Pew Research Center, especially on this issue of affirmative action, and also just give you some context for the wonderful discussion you're going to have with many of our panelists today. So first off, Pew Research Center, we are nonpartisan, non-advocacy. We don't take any sides. What we really care about is the accurate depiction of what the voices of the people and facts. And this project was funded by multiple funders, including the Pew Charitable Trust, because of the amount of resources it took to do a really deep dive of Asian American opinions and views in the United States. So first off, wanted to talk about, let's talk about the Asian American population, right? When we look at Asian Americans in general, there are 6 large origin groups: Chinese, Indian, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese, make up 85% of the total Asian US population in the US. But there are other groups, those who are 2% or less, like Pakistani, Hmong, Lao, Burmese. All of us have different starting points in America. So not everyone is high income. So if you look at all Asians, when people would say, oh, 86,000 median household income, that means everyone's doing well, right? That's not true. So when you look at disaggregation of the data by origins, you see that Indian Americans are much higher, over 6 figures of median household income, whereas Burmese, Lao, Hmong, much lower. And this really reflects the different starting points in America. Some coming in as high-skilled immigrants selected because of their educational attainment. Some came as refugees without ever planning to come into the United States and starting in very hard circumstances. And we see this in poverty rates. So Asian Americans actually have many groups that are actually in a very high poverty rate. So Burmese, Mongolian, Bangladeshi, Nepalese, Pakistani have really high 15% or more percent of the population are living in the federal poverty line. We also notice when it comes to education. So if you look at the aggregate data on Asian Americans, everyone's going to say, oh, Asians are doing really well. 54% have a bachelor's degree or above. But then again, when you disaggregate the data, you can see that there are differences where Indian Americans, 75% have a bachelor's degree, whereas Bhutanese, Lao, Hmong, Burmese, Vietnamese, much lower educational attainments. So what does it mean? And what's interesting here is that we've done work at Pew Research Center to show that Asian American population, compared to other racial and ethnic groups, have the most income inequality. You saw from the other charts about the diverse median household incomes. This is shown also with the top quintile of Asian Americans versus the bottom quintile of Asian Americans. Much big difference. The top 10% are earning 10.7 times more than the bottom 10%. This is a bigger, much more inequality than Black Americans, white and Hispanic Americans. And you can see this over time from 1970 onwards. So yes, the top 90% earners of Asian Americans have grown in terms of their earnings and are doing really well. But if you look at the bottom line, the bottom 10 percentile of the Asian American population from 1970 to 2016, their wages haven't really grown. It's been pretty much the same, just hovering around $11,000+ median household income. So what do we do at Pew Research Center? And you're going to hear a lot about the views in the next slides about affirmative action, which is a highly political topic, right? So we wanted to fill the data gap on Asian Americans so we can go really deep on understanding about Asian Americans. We conducted in 2021 66 focus groups of 18 different Asian origin groups in 18 different languages moderated by members of their ethnic group. This way, we knew that survey instruments alone would not allow us to report out in surveys Lao, Bangladeshi, or Bhutanese or Burmese views on certain issues. So we really wanted to hear from them and in their own words about topics such as affirmative action. But we also conducted a survey, so it's always good to have numbers and try to understand what's the Asian American public thinking about issues like affirmative action. So we sent out 268,000 mailings with $2 bills. That's a pretty sizable, nice condo somewhere in 50 US states and Washington, DC. This is the largest address-based sampling, what we can call probability-based sample of Asian Americans ever done, where we got respondents both on web as well as paper. So, for those who are older in language, it would more likely to answer in paper, whereas those in web are more highly educated and higher income. We conducted this in 5 different Asian languages plus English, and the field period was from July of last year till January. We basically ran like a census because we had to do a lot of mailings to the population. So what are the views? What's the topic today? We're going to talk about a term, affirmative action, and then we're also going to talk about race and ethnicity as a factor in college admissions. And sometimes people equate them together, sometimes apart. So this is something really important to understand, and we can see it in public opinion findings. First, we released this report in the beginning of June, and it came from, again, the survey that we asked in this long field period of survey. And this is just one topic of many topics. We're doing stuff on identity, global views, discrimination, many other topics, but these are just some questions based on what we knew was going to be important topic on affirmative action. So first off, in the 66 focus groups, this quote from a US-born woman of Japanese origin who's in her mid-60s kind of captures the sentiment, I would say, about Asian Americans. It's pretty mixed. The population is pretty torn around about using college admissions or in terms of affirmative action in general. Here's what she says, quote, "Well, I feel a little mixed about it. I think there are people that cannot advocate for themselves, that probably has helped. But I think it also has hindered those individuals that have accomplished a lot on their own because people make an assumption they got help or that are part of a quota." So that part of it, I think, is very difficult. It does diminish a little bit of what really has done in their own too. So I really feel mixed about it, but I think it did open a lot of the doors initially. The thought behind it was probably good and noble in some ways, but I'm not sure it's very effective too. So this is what we heard a lot. So we wanted to just ask the population so we can have numbers around it. And we asked this question about, have you heard of the term affirmative action? So this is not putting it in college context. It could be translated in terms of work context. But 3 in 4 Asian Americans have heard of the term affirmative action. And then we asked them a follow-up. Do you think it's a good thing, bad thing, or neither a good thing or a bad thing? And just over half, 53% of Asian adults say affirmative action is a good thing. And when we break it down and disaggregate it, we see some differences by origins. So if you see here, overall, again, 53% say it's a good thing, and largely most groups, majorities like Filipino, Indian, Japanese Americans say that it's a good thing. But then we notice Chinese and Vietnamese Americans in particular, just under half. So they're a little bit more skeptical in terms of thinking affirmative action is a good thing. Then we also noticed it's party. So we looked at party splits. The Asian Americans who are Democrats are more likely to say affirmative action is good than bad, while Republicans are divided. When we ask our general population of American population, the general US population, this is different because usually it's majority Republicans are against affirmative action. But here, Asian American Republicans are actually split or there's no clear majority of saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. But now let's go to not removing the word affirmative action and asking the Asian American public, should you consider race and ethnicity among a number of factors in college admissions decisions? This is where we got a clear answer, and we were trying to understand this, but college, 21% of Asian Americans say that colleges should consider race or ethnicity in admission decisions. And when we break this down, here's among other factors. So we asked this question in terms of what about the other factors, right? High school grades, so 87% of Asian Americans say yes. Standardized test scores, a majority, 71%. Community service, 71% say that should be considered when deciding students to accept to their school. But then those are the less, like athletic ability, family income, race or ethnicity, which is 21%. And we know there's a large dot now in the news because there's like possibly a case or not on family connections and legacies. 10% only of Asian Americans. This is the least like factor for Asian Americans in using it as a factor for college admissions. So when you compare to other groups, so let's compare Asian Americans with Black Americans, Hispanic, and white Americans on these two questions that I talked about. So we noticed that it's actually the general US public, only 36% of those who have heard of affirmative action say it's a good thing. Asian Americans are similar, just slightly lower than Black Americans on saying affirmative action is a good thing. But then again, when we ask the question about should race or ethnicity be considered when deciding students to be accepted to school, they're lower, but Black Americans and Asian Americans are kind of following a similar pattern on this issue, also using race and ethnicity. Now, let's talk about schools, right? So when it comes to using affirmative action or race and ethnicity in college admissions, we need to understand what's the universe of the schools that are using it, or how competitive are these schools, right? So let's give context here. This is from the common data set. And this was asked of all institutions, public and private, that were able to ask about kind of the composition of their schools and what factors they use in admissions. So, and their admission rates. So we know that there's only 2% of 1,500 public and private nonprofit baccalaureate plus institutions in the US that have an admission rate of fewer than 10%, right? So those are the, I guess you could call the highly competitive schools. But we also can see here that there's quite a lot of schools that actually admit most people who apply. So there's a really small set of selective schools. So when we look at the selective schools, there are about 123 US college universities that have a admission rate of less than 50%, right? So they don't admit 50% or less of their only of those who apply to go to the colleges. So what of these schools use race or ethnicity in college admissions? So this is ranked in terms of whether they said it's important, considered, or not considered. 72%, it's usually mostly private nonprofit colleges and universities that say that they consider it. So it's not important, it's not considered, but it's considered. And then among the schools that have an extremely high, a low admission rate, so those schools are highly selective that have a less than 10% chance of all the applicants getting admitted, 23% of them considered race and ethnicity in their in college admissions. 1% of them only say it's important. So let's now look at a different question. We asked in the same surveys about the selective colleges. So we said, what about using race and ethnicity in selective colleges in order to increase racial and ethnic diversity of the school? So we gave a purpose to for using race or ethnicity. And we still see a pattern. This is different now. Asian Americans are following more with white Americans. So about majority of Asian and white Americans disapprove of using race or ethnicity in college admissions. So it's kind of a little interesting how this pattern is a little different from what we saw earlier. So, but now let's also look at other patterns. So again, in this, for selective colleges, in order to increase racial and ethnic diversity, we ask, does this make the overall admissions process of these colleges, again, selective colleges, or less fair, more fair, or neither, or not sure, right? So 53%, so a little bit over half say it makes it less fair to use race or ethnicity as a factor in college admissions. And then the students who are accepted to these colleges, we ask them are they less qualified, more qualified, or neither, or not sure. About 36%, so there's no clear majority, but 36% of Asian Americans are saying that it makes them less qualified, that students are accepted for this college. So it's a little bit interesting of the sentiment that some people are thinking. But when we ask this question about considering race and admissions, it does actually have a positive impact on educational experience and equal opportunity. Asian Americans are saying it's no clear majority, but there are more, 37% said that it makes the overall student educational experience at these colleges better. And also 47% say it's good in ensuring equal opportunity for Americans of all racial and ethnic backgrounds. So just under half are saying, you know, it's actually a good thing to make sure that equal opportunity for all Americans of all racial and ethnic backgrounds. So this is just looking at kind of a breakdown of another question that we asked. Do you think because there's a sentiment that, you know, were you disadvantaged? Were you advantaged? Did people make you feel like you assume that you benefited unfairly, right? So when we asked this question to different racial and ethnic groups, we found that, do you think that you've ever been at a disadvantage because of efforts to increase racial or ethnic diversity? Majority of Asian Americans, actually just over half, say no, 51%. And we also noticed that of Asian Americans, about have you ever been at a disadvantage? And 62% said no. And then people have ever assumed that you've been benefited unfairly? No, 66% said no. But then we also noticed for Black American Hispanics, there is this assumption, this 1 out of 4 have assumed that they've benefited unfairly. So again, mixed sentiments across even also our focus groups, that's really showing in our surveys. We have this person who's really contemplating, US-born man of Lao origin, who's saying that, you know, there are many, you know, pretty big downsides to using, you know, affirmative action. He's saying this one side in terms of it hurts Asian Americans, but we also have other sentiment where people were telling us it actually helps and it's good to have a seat at the table and it's important for representation. So I will end there. And I don't know if we have time for questions, but this will be a great discussion after for the panels. And I guess you could put your questions into the Q&A, I believe. So there are a couple of questions. Okay. So first question is, okay, these are eye-opening tests. Okay, what was the most surprising to you about this report? One thing that's interesting is that, again, what was interesting here is that it's mixed, right? So I think what we found in our focus groups in particular, when you use the term affirmative action, people may be thinking about different things. So some people may be thinking, is it about work? Like, I think that we should have more representation. I think that we've heard a lot of people talk about lack of representation of Asian Americans in leadership in companies or in their workplace or promotions. But then when it comes to colleges, some people are saying it's a good thing, but other people, especially when we were listening to people in New York, they were talking about how it applied to high schools, because we know there are certain high schools in New York and Virginia that are public schools where admissions are really high and be competitive. And then suddenly people have a really high opinion about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. So yeah, it's really interesting how it's mixed and how you ask and what are people thinking when they think of affirmative action. Other questions?
Neil, thank you so much. It is always so interesting to hear all your detailed and compelling research. As one of the audience members wrote in, these are eye-opening stats and data. There was also a question or two about receiving a copy of the report. Please know that this event is being recorded and it will be posted on our website. So thank you again so much, Neil, for joining us. With panel discussion next, our four speakers are OiYan Poon, Program Officer at the Spencer Foundation and Co-Director at the College Admissions Futures Collaborative. Robert Teranishi, Professor of Social Science and Comparative Education and Chair in Asian American Studies at UCLA. Natasha Warikoo, Stern Professor in Social Sciences at Tufts with several books out on affirmative action. And moderating today is Bill Ong Hing, Professor at the University of San Francisco Law with expertise in immigration policy, race relations, and Asian American legal history. They all have extensive bios that are on our website, so please do take a look at all of those in detail. And again, if you in the audience have questions for our speakers, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A box and get those in soon because we are doing a hard stop at 3:30 Pacific. Let's go ahead and continue the conversation. Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Margaret. Appreciate it. I just want to get all of us on the same page and thank Neil for his presentation. The term affirmative action, the concept has been with us, to be honest with you, since the 1960s. It began with the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration, basically with respect to federal contractors, that they felt the need for more minorities to be awarded federal contracting jobs. And that's still with us, to be honest with you. And so affirmative action has not simply been about education. It's been about jobs. It's been about employment opportunities. And it hasn't always been about minorities, racial minorities. It's included women. It's included people with disabilities. And so where there has been a history of past discrimination, past practices and policies and barriers to these opportunities, various governmental entities have felt that there needs to be something affirmative done. In the education area, it's vital because, as Neil alluded to, some of the participants in the survey, there's a recognition that education is a foundation for many leadership positions, not just in employment and education, but in political realm and the economic realm. And so education, access to education is of vital importance. Honestly, we're here today because of the recent decision by the Supreme Court, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and University of North Carolina. I want to give a quick 2-minute overview of that case, just to make sure that we understand. About 45 years ago, the Supreme Court in another college case, the Bakke case, which the term reverse discrimination was used a lot. As a white applicant to medical school at UC Davis brought the lawsuit. And the vital part about that case was two things. The Supreme Court was critical of quotas, set-asides for groups of people, but the Supreme Court recognized that race was a valid factor. They allowed Alan Bakke in to UC Medical School at the time, but it was critical that the Supreme Court said that race can be used because there is a compelling interest in diversity. And that was recognized again in 2003 in the Grutter decision. The Supreme Court again said that race could be used as a factor. And so here we are in this new case. It was led by a far-right conservative, Ed Blum, who reached out to various groups who might be supportive, including Asian Americans. And a nonprofit was formed, and the organization includes applicants for college admission, their parents, and others. And the Supreme Court ruled in a 6-3 decision that race as a factor could only be used in certain circumstances, most notably, and I'll come back to this in a minute, in the college essays, but effectively by a 6-3 vote, the now conservative Supreme Court overruled the Grutter decision. It didn't do it specifically, but in substance, that's pretty much what it did. And writing for the majority, Chief Justice Roberts explained that college admissions can't consider race merely to allow an applicant to explain how their race influenced their character in a way that would have a concrete effect on the university, but a student must be treated based on his or her own experiences as an individual, not on the basis of race. Both programs, the University of North Carolina and Harvard, began, according to Roberts, considered race as part of the admissions program for training future leaders and promoting robust exchange of ideas. Those were good goals, but Roberts felt that those goals were too vague to be able to be measured. And so the one of the big points that came up in Roberts' view was that it was a zero-sum aspect to college admissions, and an increase in Roberts' views, an increase in one group's admissions must result in a decrease for one or more other group, and that was a primary factor in assessing. He didn't use the word affirmative action, but he felt that that was a primary factor. And so the lawsuits basically, the language of the Roberts opinion implies that they treat admission to Harvard and the University of North Carolina as a prize, whereas the defendants in the case emphasized that this was much more about wider criteria of merit, including life experiences of applicants on the educational and social benefits for the entire student body. And I know that Professor Warikoo has some views on that. So in sum and substance, what we have after this decision is that race as a category cannot be used for as a criteria for admission, and that universities are going to have to go about it in a different way. You should know in California, we've lived with this now since the 1990s because of Prop 209 and University of California Regents decisions. But let me stop there and ask an initial question to each one of the panelists. What would you add to the audience's understanding of this decision and also about affirmative action or college admissions? OiYan Poon, you want to go first?
Yes, Professor Hing, I will go first. I think one of the things that's really important to think about is this is an opaque process. And quite frankly, I think there's a lot of misunderstandings and lack of fact and basis of understanding of how college admissions works. Neil presented the data on how many colleges are out there. There's very few, I have to talk about it in past tense now, there were very few that were considering race as a factor. But how race was factored in actually benefited Asian Americans, especially across the economic spectrum and ethnic diversity. That's actually my area of study, and you know how it works, and now we've got basically race as one consideration has been taken away, and I think that will especially disadvantage low-income Asian Americans and underrepresented Asian Americans. I won't go into, we don't have time to go into all the ways that admissions actually works, but you can read my very dense research on that if you'd like.
Right, okay. Dr. Warikoo, what would you add?
Sure, thank you. Thank you to the Asian Society for this invitation and putting this together, and to all of you for being here. I guess I was thinking about, I have lots of things to say on affirmative action, and I was like, okay, what's the one thing for right now? And I think, you know, perhaps I'm assuming we have a largely Asian American audience. The thing that I thought I would try to explain a little bit is this idea that in this lawsuit, you know, in the lawsuit at Harvard, Asian Americans were kind of front and center, right? So this while, in every other case that made it to the US Supreme Court, there were always named plaintiffs. But in this one, it was just this organization called Students for Fair Admissions that was supposed to be at Harvard in particular, representing Asian Americans. And this was, of course, organized by Edward Bloom, who is not Asian American, who, tried a white plaintiff, lost in the previous case, and turned to Asian Americans. But I think he tapped into this kind of fear, or this, I think, belief that a lot of Asian Americans perhaps understandably have of, it seemed a little weird. Like, why is it that the average SAT score, the average GPA of admitted Asian American students to Harvard was a little bit higher than those of even white students who were admitted, right? And who aren't benefiting from affirmative action. And so is there some kind of Asian penalty, right? And I will admit that before this case, I was like, I don't understand that. That's kind of weird. And then, all of this data came out in the case that kind of helped reveal what's actually going on. And what I learned, so Harvard had to release a lot of admissions data that was then analyzed over and over again by a lot of economists, looking at, trying to understand how people get in. And what I realized was that that the way students are admitted, you have all of these really amazing young people applying, like many times over the number of seats. And so then there's got to be something that kind of pushes you over the edge, right? So among those amazing people, who is getting in? And what I saw was that there are certain things that that white students are advantaged over all students of color, including Asian Americans, including Black students, including Latinx and Native Americans. These are things like, things that have been, coming up in the media. And that more recently, legacy admission, athletic recruiting, and other, smaller things like, the university wants to make sure there's enough students who want to major in the humanities. People of color tend to be a little more pragmatic and want to major in STEM fields or engineering. And things like wanting representation from every state. So there are a lot of these different factors. Now, whether or not we think those are the right criteria is a different question, right? But these criteria were not designed to exclude people of color. They were not designed to exclude Asian Americans or any other minority group, but in fact, they do play this role. And this is what I saw was part of this is what I saw in the data that explains that difference. And there was that kind of personal rating. And again, I think this kind of non-academic rating, I think came out in, if people saw, there was a great report in the New York Times a few days ago about the sort of top 1% and the advantages that they have in college admissions to the kind of very elite colleges. And, what we see is that, white students much more likely to be going to private school where they're getting stronger letters of recommendation. And that seems to be the factor that explains that rating from some of the research that Julie Park at University of Maryland did. And so, there are all these things that happen, and whether we agree or disagree with them, I think is a conversation we can have, but whether they are designed, it seems very clear to me that they are not designed to exclude Asian Americans. And so this idea that there's Asian American discrimination, I think, is problematic. Right. And the end of race conscious admissions, if there were any kind of, implicit racial bias or anything like this, the end of race conscious admission certainly is not going to do anything about that. So I thought I would just
thank you. And again, thanks for pointing out to the audience that what we're labeling affirmative action today in terms of race, there are all these other programs where universities actually act affirmatively to benefit different groups. Dr. Teranishi, what would you add to the audience's basic understanding of affirmative action?
Thank you, Bill. I think the first thing I would say is, I'm glad you brought up the historical context of affirmative action. And, it's important to point out that Ed Bloom, he did not pursue these cases against Harvard and USC or UNC because he wanted to help Asian American applicants. He did this because he wanted to kill affirmative action. He's had this agenda for a long time. And he was at the center of the Fisher case, which is the case that was just prior to, this most recent Supreme Court case on affirmative action. So the Fisher case was just in 2016. It wasn't heard, that long ago. And As Natasha mentioned, this was a white plaintiff. Her name was Abigail Fisher. And it turns out she was a daughter of one of Bloom's friends, so he basically looks for plaintiffs who he can use to put together a case, to go after a law. And that's how it all kind of played out in terms of moving on to Asian Americans. And, we saw this happening a long time ago because he was reaching out to people in the Asian American community. And, there's always been this long history of Asian Americans being used as a wedge group, to advance the interest of other groups. And I just think it's an important context for where we are today.
Thanks. Thanks for, let me push back on you on this point that Asian Americans were picked by, or that were approached by Bloom for his purposes, and that your implication was that Asian Americans were being used by him. But wouldn't you agree that there are some Asian Americans, and that showed in the slides, right? Wouldn't you agree that there are some Asian Americans who are also opposed to affirmative action in higher ed, the use of race in higher ed, in the same way that Bloom is?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that definitely there's Asian Americans who are sending their kids to college. They have concerns about the ways in which race is a factor and how it affects their chances of their own child being admitted to college. But, Bloom was really the one who came up with the strategy and, sought out the defendants, and,
Right.
the timing was done in a certain way that would advantage them in this decision. So I don't know of groups, Asian American groups or individuals who approached him to pursue this case.
That's a good point.
Yeah, it was more
That's a good
going
point. Yeah, right. Yeah.
to the family.
Yeah. So, OiYan, I want to back up a little bit with you. And why did you start studying this area of college admissions, and what drove you to do that, and what did you find in your work? And I might add that I think maybe all three of you were signers to the amicus brief on Harvard side, but I know that Anita was a driving force behind that. But go ahead.
Yeah, so this actually goes back to about 20 years ago. I was working at UC Davis. Interestingly, the UC's had an affirmative action ban starting in the late 90s, and Bill and the professors in the Asian American Studies program there hired me as a student affairs officer in that program because there were issues of anti-Asian racism and discrimination and violence, and the need to advance the Asian American Studies program. And while I was there, I became an admissions reader at UC Davis, so with a ban on race-conscious admissions. And when I entered that work, I was very much like the folks that Neil described in his presentation. I just wasn't sure what was, how things were. But then when I became an admissions reader and learned how systems and practices in admissions worked, I started realizing the lack of, without understanding who these students were, what their racial background was, I felt very hindered from fully understanding who any student was, regardless of racial background, right, or ethnic identity. It was really hard to understand the full picture of any given student. And I felt really, it felt like the whole process was very lacking in fairness. So I went from someone who was very middle of the road, not sure whether race-conscious admissions affirmative action was good or bad, and then seeing it in action, being part of the process, then made me realize, oh my gosh, this is actually hurting a lot of people. And even though people think like, oh, it's more fair, it actually became not so fair because you don't get to understand the full context of where any given student is coming from, and what their opportunity structures were, because we understand that the K-12 system is deeply inequitable, especially across race and class, and gender, I would add. And so without that information, I felt really hindered. So then that led me to wanting to really study further, because that was one institution, one large university system, but there's, as Neil put out there, over 1,500 four-year baccalaureate granting institutions. And so that really led me into studying these things. And what I realized is the way people talk about admissions is it's merit, 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 your qualities, qualifications, blah, blah, blah. It's not. It really isn't. College admissions is about meeting institutional interests and desires. So what the mission is, it goes back to the organizational mission. So 1,500 plus institutions, they have different institutional missions and goals and aims, and quite frankly, annual balance sheets for their financials, right? And so in studying, how admissions works, one of the most common questions I heard from folks in my studies has been, the thing they really want to know is, first of all, we're talking about these, slightly over 100 colleges and universities that are rejecting at least half, right? So it's a very small number of institutions. And when you cut it down to that, and then these institutions are basically receiving way more highly qualified students. So it's not about this thing called merit, which Natasha has studied a lot and talked about a lot. It becomes different. It becomes about what are the different priorities? What are the institutional priorities? So that includes, colleges like to brag about having all 50 states, territories, multiple countries represented in their institutions among students. So it becomes a geographic priority, geographic diversity priority. They like to, they've got athletic teams, right? And athletic teams on college campuses are predominantly white. Student athletes are, I think the last stat I looked at from the NCAA was 86% white, right? So these are all things that are, and Natasha mentioned legacies, donors, there's faculty tips, right? Like there's all these children of faculty, right? So my kid will have a tip, right? In admissions. Natasha also mentioned what folks want to study. Tufts, for example, a few years ago acquired a fine arts school. That meant that year in admissions, they were admitting lots and lots of art students, right? More than they ever had before, right? And so these are the different things that happen with an organization over time that changes, that makes their priorities different. But the most astounding question or priority that I heard was, hey, we've only got X dollars for financial aid, and this is especially the private colleges, right? We only have X number of dollars for financial aid, and we can't blow that budget. So we have to figure out, here's the students we would love to admit, but can we afford this group of students?
Let me interrupt you there and switch over to Natasha for a moment, because there's several, and all three of you, feel free to jump in whenever you want to. I think there are a couple of things that you raised, OiYan and Natasha, you may want to respond to, and you may want to respond to one of the questions that I just saw in maybe you don't have access to it, but the Q&A asked, one of the questioners said that, hey, all these college coaches, they all claim that there's an Asian penalty, okay? And so respond a little bit or follow up on a couple of things that OiYan raised that might be relevant to your research and your views, but also, what is it with this Asian penalty thing?
Yeah, so I'll start with the Asian penalty, and then I'm going to come back to some of the things that OiYan was talking about.
Right.
So this idea, so I think college counselors do not have, do not know what's happening inside the admissions office.
You mean they really don't know everything?
I'm sure they know a lot, but I think, again, I think this is a misguided understanding. Again, I just want to reiterate, I had that understanding. It looks kind of weird, but when you start looking at that data, it's all these other factors. Now, again, I'm not saying that I agree with any or all of them. I certainly don't agree with all of them, many of them, but they are not about someone being Asian, right? So the college, particularly like the small liberal arts colleges, a huge percentage of their student bodies are recruited athletes because they still want to have a full, crew team, a water polo team, a lacrosse team, all of these sports. And that means that a very high percentage of students are recruited athletes, and 70% of recruited athletes at the elites are white. And so again, I did this, I'll just give you, maybe this is partly an explanation. I did research at a suburban community that had a well-off suburb that had a large and growing Asian American population, and talked to a lot of parents in this community. And one of the things that I noticed and really understood much more was the ways that parents have different ways of figuring out how to help their children get ahead. As parents, I'm a parent, we all want the best for our children, but we have different ways, we have different skills and resources and ideas about what that looks like. Asian American parents tend to place more emphasis on, everybody knows that academics is important, but Asian Americans play a little bit more, I'm gonna sort of, push academics, because that is, for highly skilled migrants, they're coming from an education system in which what you get on that standardized test on the national exam is all that matters for where you go to college in India or China or Korea. And that's what they understand, right? And anything that is outside of that feels corrupt, right? Ooh, it's holistic. They don't really tell you what exactly it is. That is a sign in those countries. So that feels very that sits very uneasily with those parents. So, the white, and these are generalizations, there was a lot of diversity in these groups. The white parents tended to much more, again, also cared about academics, but focused, but also wanted their children to excel in extracurriculars. For some of them, it was sports, and put a lot of resources and energy into that, and their kids were more likely than Asian American kids to be recruited athletes. And again, these are about like what parents think is the quote unquote right way of helping your kid get ahead. And these align with the college admission systems of their countries. And so I think these admissions counselors are mistaken. I don't think that there's an Asian penalty. I think that kids are showing strength and kind of excelling in different things. And the white students seem to be aligned much more with what the colleges are looking for, broadly speaking. Now, and this goes, all of this, I think, raises this question of what's the right way? What are the criteria? What should we be looking at? And I think, even just on this panel, we could sit here for hours, and I don't think the four of us would come to an agreement on what's merit, what's fair, what's like the perfect admission system. And I think, the way that we define, how we select people when there's more people who want something than there is a way of defining merit. But college admissions, and OiYan said this so well, this is about what the college's priorities. If you can't pay the bills, like there's no mission to be had, right? So financial aid, it's the coach is beating down your door. You gotta, listen, like that's been a priority. So all of these things and are about, and we need to stop talking about admission, stop getting that sticker and putting it on our car as if this is a measure of our worth, where we or our children go to college, right? This is not a reward for someone who's more deserving. So, if a kid gets in Harvard, that doesn't mean they deserve that they're better than a kid who, is, not even going to college or going to UMass Boston down the street. And I really think we have to get away from this idea of merit and meritocracy and deservingness.
Right,
that's not what's happening, and it's damaging.
Yeah, let me reach out to Robert here. Robert, couple things. One, help us, and Neil did this a little bit, put into perspective some of the selective college admissions data. That's one thing. And the other thing is, you told us at our pre-meeting that you don't think this decision, the Supreme Court decision, is necessarily going to help Asian American college applicants, which is counterintuitive. So explain those things.
Yeah, sure. So I'm really glad OiYan is, and Natasha, they're kind of getting in the weeds about how the sausage is made, because, what really, I think what I've learned about studying college admissions for the past 20 years is it's a reflection of an institution's values, right? And so for a public institution, you know, we have to also put this in the context of states' priorities. So like in California, they put a cap on out-of-state students, right? It's actually written into the law, like they have to set aside so many seats for in-state residents. Like, I mean, in my opinion, that's kind of a form of affirmative action, right? So it is in part about meritocracy, but you know, meritocracy, it's a socially and politically constructed concept, as Natasha's pointing out, right? It's like there's good reasons why we don't just rely on grades and test scores to admit students. In many cases, it's also about fit, and it's about where students feel like they're going to fit in best, and you know, what institutions want to know is, where do you come from? What is your life experience like? What can you contribute to the institution and experience of other students who attend that institution? And you know, I was an expert consultant for the Harvard, in the Harvard district court case, and you know, I was able to kind of look more closely at what happens at Harvard. And you know, I'll tell you, I left that experience thinking, you know, I don't envy those admissions folks at Harvard. Like, you know, Harvard admits less than 2,000 applicants. That's a rejection rate of 96.6%. Okay, so imagine if you start out just by throwing away half the applications, or even 3/4 of them, then you still have to go through a process of selecting what's left to get to 2,000 admittees. But you know, scoring higher on the SAT cannot guarantee you admissions to Harvard. You know, there's back when we were looking at the data, there were 17,225 students who scored in the top 1% of the SAT. Harvard could not even admit even 1/10 of those students. You know, it's just remarkable, the situation they're in terms of admissions. Ranking at the top of your high school class cannot guarantee you admissions. In 2014, there were 26,500 public secondary schools, 10,000 private secondary schools. Harvard cannot even admit 1 out of every 10 students who scored in the top of their class, you know? So it's important to kind of put it in perspective in terms of what is involved in highly selective admissions. And what was your second question about?
Well, it's yeah. I think you kind of answered it. The case is not going to actually necessarily help Asian American applicants get in, and you, like you said, the standards are so difficult for any applicant. Right?
OiYan, could you talk about the research you did following Prop 209?
You mean with the UC system?
Yeah.
I mean, I just did kind of like a basic descriptive analysis of the numbers out of the UC system, where the admit rates, right? Oftentimes people will point to the University of California after 209 and say like, wow, look at the campuses, right? There's so many more Asian kids on these 9 undergraduate campuses or 10 undergraduate campuses. But what they're not looking, that's the enrollment, right? That's different than the admit rate, right? Like how many students you admit from the applicant pool, right? And so what was really interesting was that there was a decline. There was a, you know, consistent decline starting in the late 90s of the admit rate for Asian American students, Black students, Latinx students, Native American students. But it was pretty stable, I think, if I remember. It's been a while, but for white students, it stayed pretty consistent, generally speaking. So it got harder and harder for all students of color, including Asian Americans, to get into the UC. Right. So then the next question, I'm sure people are like, well, then why did it look like the enrollment numbers went up? I think the easiest way to explain that is Asian Americans in California love the UCs. I mean, who wouldn't? What a great bargain, quite frankly, right? World-class universities at state university prices. And so Asian Americans are more likely, like twice as likely than anyone else, to say yes to the UC when they get admitted.
Yeah,
okay, so
I would just
go ahead.
there's a behavioral dimension to this, right? Because what we saw after Prop 209 is an increase in the number of applications coming from Asian Americans and white applicants. And what was really concerning for me was not just how the policy affected what the institutions could do or couldn't do, but there was a pretty precipitous decline in the number of applicants, Black and Latino applicants. And so that hurt the actual pool available from which institutions could admit students. The other thing that happened, which people don't often talk about, is yield, which is that once a student is admitted, who's likely to accept that admissions offer? And the yield rate for Black and Latino students declined significantly. So even when the students were admitted, they said, I don't feel welcome in a UC campus. I would rather go to a private institution, an HBCU, or elsewhere. The yield rate for Asian Americans increased following Prop 209.
Okay, so I want to get to the audience questions and answers in a minute, but I want to throw something out to all three of you, and that is that's evidence that was used against Harvard. One of the experts that testified on behalf of the plaintiffs is Richard Collenberg, and in his work, he's looked at data, and basically he and others, let's see who the other person that's cited in the thing that I'm looking at, Raj Chetty, actually, their claim is that Harvard hasn't accomplished what it has wanted to anyway, and that if you look at the admissions at Harvard, something like the top 1% of Harvard, the top 1% of wealthy people, wealthy students, they amount to as many as the bottom 60% of class, and that basically their argument is that you should be using an economic affirmative action program. You should look at economic class rather than race, because it ends up that most of the people that get into a school like Harvard are wealthy people anyway. And so that, what are you accomplishing when you're doing that? And shouldn't we move to an economic class basis for admissions? And David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, picked up on this recently too. What do you think, Natasha?
Yeah, so just to clarify, there's two different things. So one is Richard Collenberg, who's been talking about class-based kind of considerations over race, for many years testified on behalf of SFFA. Raj Chetty never testified or
he didn't testify, but I think
he had that big article. I know he wrote that study, and
right, about the most affluent 10% of the population, right? Yeah.
Yes. I would say that so two things about class. Absolutely, these colleges are terrible when it comes to class. That is there is no doubt about that, and we knew that, and this report makes it like it's even more egregious than we thought, right? That the advantages that the top 1% in particular have, and that study controls for SAT score, right? So it masks how bad it is. So let me just be clear that I agree with that 100%. I think the problem is that we have to take an intersectional approach to class and race. This is not an either or. It's not like you can have class-based considerations or you can have race, but you can't have both, right? You absolutely can have both, and you should. And we should be thinking about, because there's so much research in the United States about the way that race plays a role independent of class. So if you look at a Black family and a white family of the same household income, the white family is going on average is going to live in a neighborhood that has a higher median household income. So their neighborhood has more resources. That means their children's school has more resources. That means that, I've been complaining about, so I've just been saying, sorry, that how much my neighbors sometimes pay my kids to do like odd jobs. And it's like, I think about that. Like if we lived in a different neighborhood, they would get paid less, right? And all these little things that you don't think about. And in those neighborhoods, there are more extracurricular activities available. Of course, you have to be able to afford them. So there are all these things. A part of this is related to wealth, right?
Right.
The average Black family has 1/10 the average white family's wealth, because that is accumulated over generations. So that's just one example. And this is true of poor families. This is true of upper professional families as well. And so we have to take, so again, I think this idea that, oh, well, we'll just pivot to class, to me, that sort of ignores the role that race plays in American society. So absolutely, but you know, it's both.
Thank you. Yeah. OiYan, before you answer, I want to encourage the audience to submit their questions in the Q&A section. Go ahead, OiYan. Did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I was just nodding and, you know, just furious agreement with Natasha. You know, I think one of the things I found was every college that I studied was already considering race and class. And I think, you know, oftentimes in these conversations, people will cite the Thomas Espenshade study from the late 90s, or the data set was from the 90s. And they will say, like, look, Asians have to score so much higher. But what the finding that people citing that study never really point to is that low-income Asian Americans were benefiting significantly from race-conscious admissions. And that is also stated in the Espenshade study, right? So to Natasha's point, I think what you're saying is basically, you know, wealth and poverty and class are different by racial groups, right? And I think as Neil's presentation showed, especially for Asian Americans, it is a wide-ranging situation here when we're talking about race. And so it's hard to not think about, and several people that I talked to in my interviews at these highly selective colleges, when I asked them point blank, you know, should Asian American applicants not talk about or indicate their racial identity? And what these people said was like, that has always hurt the applicants I have read every single time. Because again, it goes back to what I was sharing earlier, you don't get a full picture of who that student is and their qualities and characteristics and what they bring to a campus, especially if that is really part of a student's who they are, their identity. You know, Sally Chen, who testified in the Harvard case in favor of racial diversity and race-conscious admissions, she was a Harvard student, not perfect test scores, not perfect grades, right? Went to Lowell High School in San Francisco. And she, you know, she looked at her file and it was all about how, as a Chinese American girl, right? That was part of who she was, very importantly, out of how she, you know, engages in leadership activities, or what she brings to a classroom in an educational setting, right? And her counselors did tell her, don't talk about that. And she said, no, that's who I am, right? And if this is what we want, right, like Asian American representation, then represent our stories. And that's exactly what Justice Roberts said in the opinion, right? Colleges can continue to look at these stories. Students should continue showing up with who they are, right? If we believe in Asian American representation, then do it, show it.
Right.
And it will hurt. I think it's not going to help students to hide who they are. That's what a damaging concept too, psychologically, emotionally, you got to hide who you are.
Right. Robert, Robert, you want to comment on class? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, Natasha was spot on by saying, you know, it's not an either or proposition. It's, you know, and there's no reason why you can't look at both class and race, and there's a lot of merit in looking at the intersections between race and class. I've done research on Asian American community college students and the types of issues that they're dealing with. I'm talking about Asian American community college students. It's so unique to their lived experiences, you know, as children of immigrants, you know, helping out their families with their family-owned business, working another job on their own on the side, taking their financial aid check and, you know, helping the family out. But you know, their hours per week working, just how they were spreading their time in different ways as other community college students, you know, taking care of siblings, taking care family members at home.
Right.
I think that's the context that I think is missed in all this conversation about Asian Americans and selective college admissions, because only a small fraction of Asian American college students are going to go to a highly selective university. Their highest concentration, Asian American college students, highest concentration is actually in community colleges. It's not even in a four-year institution. And there's a really high concentration of some subgroups with low rates of educational attainment, a lack of access to resources and opportunities. Their stories and their needs and their challenges are not being represented in these discussions about Asians and their obsessions with selective college admission.
Yeah, that's such an important reminder to us, and I see that in to be honest with you, I see that in not just low-income communities, but immigrant communities across the board, not just Asian. So we have a very astute audience. There's a couple very hard questions that they've put in the chat. One of them, we've alluded a couple times to mission, what the mission of the college is. And I guess how would you write a mission statement for a university that might encourage the kind of diversity that you would want? Is that possible?
Yeah, analysis. I mean, colleges have mission statements, and there's been analyses of, what do they tend to say? And colleges tend to talk about the one thing that most have in common is talking about wanting to contribute to society in some way. So, there's some sort of like, this is not just about the individual. This is about, a goal in bettering society in a variety of ways, right? And so you can think about bettering society as, being a scientist who discuss, who's looking at, medicines or vaccines, or an entrepreneur who creates jobs, or, a teacher, or an activist. So there are a lot of different roles, but I think that mission of contributing to society is something that we need to keep front and center much more. The uber elites, which is the ones we're talking about when we're talking about affirmative act, race conscious admissions, they are often also, Harvard in particular talks about educating the leaders of tomorrow, right? And how to, what does leadership need to look like for it to be seen as legitimate? Sandra Day O'Connor, Republican appointee, when she in the 2003 decision on race conscious admissions, talked about this. She said, if you have a leadership that it does not reflect the people, they will not be seen as legitimate. And that was the rationale for the military. The military got an exception in this ruling last month that, there was a recognition that, we need to have diversity in our leadership. Otherwise, there's going to be, we're not going to be able to have order in the military. And so I don't know why that doesn't apply to the rest of society.
Exactly. I thought that part of the decision was so hypocritical, because if you recognize the value of leadership anywhere, a diverse leadership in the military, come on, that means every part of society does value.
Yeah,
diversity,
mobility, and social mobility, like all of these things. The elites are terrible on social mobility. The places that are much better on social mobility are our big state schools, our community colleges, much more, doing so much more on that mission with so much less.
Oh yeah, and we cut you off.
Yeah, can I double click on that military hypocrisy, right? Like that it's a national security imperative that our strategic leaders and thinkers that are educated at West Point, Annapolis, and the Air Force Academy need to be a racially diverse learning places, but that's not okay for colleges. Is just depths of hypocrisy is just unbelievable. But what I wanted to say is that I'm very worried about science, right? Like, because we know, I mean, from two ways, right? Like the best scientific thinking and creativity comes from diverse teams, right? And we're seeing outcomes of scientific teams that are not diverse, right? Like things like pulse ox, I don't know how to pronounce those things that measure your blood oxygen level,
right?
Right? Those have been proven to fail a lot with folks with darker skin tones, right?
Interesting.
Right. So as one example, artificial intelligence, the facial scanning things. There's all these stories coming out about how those are very much favoring white, lighter skinned folks. Right. So that's just two examples of how science is going to suffer. And it's
I want to get to Robert with this next hard question, and it's whether the model minority myth with respect to Asian Americans, how does that play into what we're talking about, especially when there's kind of a black-white binary in terms of much of society? Did the Asian model minority image play into the admissions case? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, because I think first the perception that American society has about Asian Americans is that, they're overachievers, they're obsessed with, being at the best university. And there's also a perception that they're taking over a lot of these top institutions. And, so when they hear this case coming about, and then they hear Asian Americans say, hey, you guys are putting a quota on us, and you guys are trying to stop us from getting in. I think people, they're like, yeah, it makes sense that that there's this lawsuit.
Interesting.
And, it concerns me a lot. I mean, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, which is that it's not representative. It's not an accurate rendering of what's really going on in terms of Asians in college participation and what are their biggest concerns and challenges, right? So college affordability, helping students succeed once they're attending college. I mean, these are things that are a much bigger issue in the Asian American community than, the 1% that wants to get their kid into Harvard,
Right.
So it's being misrepresented, and and we're being positioned in a way where it kind of makes it seem like that's our thing.
Okay, so here's a question, an important question, and it's about when we alluded to the fact that Asian Americans were used kind of as a wedge in interest of kind of by somebody who might be a white supremacist. What kind of education do we need to do within our own communities on issues, not just on admissions, but just generally about our values? OiYan?
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in here and just say that I think something that's really lacking within Asian American communities and public education is a political education, right? Like an Asian American studies centered, ethnic studies centered curriculum, right? I mean, there's some states that are moving forward with ethnic studies curriculum standards. I worry though, at the same time. So I live in Illinois. Illinois passed the first Asian American history requirement for all schools. My child is in a Chicago public school. I'm nervous. I'm nervous for the day that she comes home and says, like, we opened fortune cookies today for Asian American history, right? Like, we need to keep pushing, like, how do we make sure we bring along and make sure that our stories are represented, but learned appropriately in relationship to other people of color too, right? Because Asian American history does not exist without Black history and Black struggle, right? The Asian American movement came from that civil rights movement, if you study like centuries back, right? And how we have thrived and moved forward and progressed has been very much in tandem and in solidarity with other people of color.
Yeah, I want to get to I want to get to a question that I have, and that's, okay, is this one of these situations where from chaos we can create something positive? What's college admissions going to look like now? What kind of admissions program should universities be setting up? Go ahead, Natasha.
Natasha and I were just in DC last week at the U.S.
Okay.
Department of Education. So
what did you guys say or learn?
I mean, there's a lot of chatter at this meeting, and I'll tell you what I think. I mean, I think that, and I'm not going to be prescriptive here, but I think sort of broadly speaking, we need to think about admissions much more as a sort of, how do we admit students in a way that furthers our mission? And really, like, look at all of these things. You know, does having someone from every state further our mission? Does, you know, the weight that we place on athletic recruitment further our mission? Does, you know, and, you know, again, the thing that I forgot to say earlier about the class thing is that these colleges have a certain budget, right? Most of these selective colleges are tuition dependent, and they cost more, well over the median household income in this country. So do the math. Like, the whole financing of higher education, elite higher education, is dependent on having a student body that skews wealthy. That is the only way that the math works, the budget works. And we may not like it. I certainly don't like it, but, you know, until we solve that problem, the kind of class is gonna, you know, there's nothing we can do about that. And so, but what we can do is say, okay, let's think about what is our mission, and let's look ahead, right? If we are saying we want to contribute to society, let's admit students who we think as a cohort is most likely to do that, rather than looking behind at, well, what'd you do? What SAT score did you get? What's your GPA? How many, you know, extracurriculars did you? What are the nuggets in there that tell us that you might be our next change maker? You might be our next, you know, breakthrough scientist. We don't know, but how can we sort of think about the future and what this cohort together will do as a group in the future? And I think if we sort of take that lens, it leads us to make different kinds of decisions that I think and do different kinds of things that colleges are doing right now.
Right. Robert, you want to answer?
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, I hope that institutions, you know, there's what they say and what they do, right? And I hope what they do aligns with what they say. And at the same time, I hope what they say aligns with what they're doing. You know, so if they are going to pursue an admissions process that, you know, places a certain value on pursuing students from certain backgrounds, I don't think they should be afraid to say that. You know, they're very risk adverse when it comes to talking about what they actually do. And I think that's part of the problem, is that people don't understand what's happening behind closed doors. And it's creating a lot of confusion. It's creating people, you know, having a lot of assumptions. And, you know, I wish that institutions would be more open and maybe make some type of pact about doing so.
Right. So let me say something personal first and turn it over to the three of you, because I want you to address this as well. And OiYan knows this. I left UC Davis in 2010, in part actually because of the effect of Prop 209 on the UC schools, namely with respect to the African American population. There have been awful stories about the few number of Blacks that have been admitted to UC law schools. Every UC law school has a very, very small number of incoming since Prop 209, or since whatever year that was. And one year at Berkeley, there was only one African American admit, and that was about 12 years ago. And so when I was asked to visit at the University of San Francisco, that was the most notable thing. That there were African Americans and there continues to be. And so I choose to teach in an institution where two things. One, and we've all said this, I think, you know, being in the classroom, it's very valuable to have a diverse group of students. And it's just not just it's not just the different backgrounds, but it's just the different ideas and experiences and that kind of stuff. But I also want to take part in training future leaders from diverse communities, okay? And because I believe that that's part of my contribution to social justice. And what do you think? I'm hoping that you feel the same way, but maybe you can add something. I don't know if you're in the classroom anymore, OiYan, but what do you think?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, this bears out with decades and decades, and Robert's very familiar with this research too, on the educational benefits of diversity, right? Like even on the individual level, but also on the collective community societal level. But on the individual level, right, there's cognitive advances, civic engagement levels, are higher when folks are engaged in diverse learning environments. There's just so many benefits to diversity educationally, to the individual, but also to the society, right? Like when we all boats rising kind of idea, right? So I'm deeply worried about how this is going to bear out on these educational campuses, right? So different campuses have different educational missions and brands and approaches. You're at USF, it's a Jesuit institution, Bill. I was educated at a Jesuit university. I used to work at another Jesuit university. That's a very social justice mission. And so following suit, right, I think you have to think about what you're evaluating people for inviting into that particular educational project, right? Like those campuses should not be admitting people who are like, yeah, I'm totally against social justice. I'm not for it, right? I don't demonstrate it. I don't show it, right? What was fascinating to me is working in the UC post 2009 was how much further other factors or evaluation criteria were leaned into, right? So I taught a lot of students who were very good at multiple choice, evaluations, but
Right.
these are like, I'm thinking about my UCLA students right now, right? Where I had to teach them how to write full paragraphs and flesh out ideas and papers and that kind of thing. But give them a multi-choice test, man, they were great at that.
Right.
And that was deeply concerning because what do we want as a society? Do we want people? It just became kind of, yeah. And then the students that I talked to, the Asian American students I talked to at UCLA, a lot of them were like, we feel like we're missing out in our learning experience without learning with Black, Latino students,
Absolutely.
American students.
Let me give Robert and Natasha a chance before we close. Go ahead, Robert. Yeah.
So I would just add that, if you think about where we're at as a society when it comes to race relations, when it comes to even issues like racial segregation, we live, we go to school, and we work with people who are a lot like ourselves, right? That's basically what the data is showing. And it's very similar to where we were at in the 1950s. And, college is one of the places where students are often forced to be around and interact with people who are not like themselves. And, the importance of that can't be understated, right? Because once they leave college, they're going to go back to what they were doing. And, when Asian Americans interact with other students, non-Asian Americans, they come to see other groups more favorably. And I think what's also important is, other groups come to see Asian Americans more favorably. Like we need those situations where we're forcing people to have uncomfortable conversations about who they are, where they come from, what their life experiences are. And that's kind of, in my opinion, like what's at stake with this affirmative action decision. This is the thing that concerns me a lot about where our society is going.
Right. Thank you, Natasha.
Yeah, I mean, I think OiYan and Robert have said this well. It's and I was looking through the chat, the Q&A to see like, is there any last questions that I get? There's so many great questions that you all have raised, and I guess the thing that I would sort of leave everyone with is just this idea of trying to understand Asian Americans as a kind of racial minority that is different from the racialized experiences of Black Americans, of Latinx Americans, of Native Americans. I love a very old article, if anyone is kind of wonky in this room, Claire Kim's racial triangulation framework. It's amazing how relevant it still is today. And she talks about how there are different kinds of racial stereotypes that affect groups differently. You know, I think Asian Americans can be stereotyped as good at academics, not so good at sports. Black Americans can be racialized as, you know, really good at sports, not so good at academics. And these stereotypes have consequences for how we get treated in school, for how people view us. You know, we both experience racial attacks that have been brutal at times, but in different contexts and in different ways. And I think it's really important to sort of separate, like to understand that those are different and they operate differently, and one does not diminish the other. And they both affect people's lived experiences. But to try to say like we're all racial minorities or you know, we're not, but just to understand the complexity of race in the United States. And also that these stereotypes, she talks about them being mutually constitutive, right? The stereotype of Asian Americans is related to stereotype of Black Americans and vice versa. And I think what we can do as a group is to try to understand the way that all of those things have a negative impact on all of us. And to try to, you know, be allies in the struggle for justice. And that looks different for all of these groups, but to work together. So maybe that's my sort of.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I would close by saying that this is about community. I'm urging people to not look at their lives and their communities in solely individualistic ways, that we all benefit from wide exposure to different ideas, different people of different backgrounds. And I hope that you are open to putting yourself in those situations and your children in those situations, because that I think about my own children and my grandchildren, and you know, those are the values that I want them to learn, you know, because this is about the common good. And that's the one thing about the United States, is that this isn't my phrase, but it's a nation that's ongoing, it's an experiment that continues to change, and the better way to approach society, I think, is in a much more egalitarian, open-minded, open-armed way. So Margaret, I'm going to turn it over to you to close.
Bill, that was a beautiful way to close. Big thanks to all of our speakers. We're getting some wonderful feedback in the Q&A box. Bill, OiYan, Robert, Natasha, and Neil, amazing conversation. Thank you for sharing your expertise in helping us navigate a very complicated topic and topics. And thank you also for sharing your personal stories. You've given us a lot to think about, and it was really great to see the depth of questions from our audience as well. We'll have to have you back. We have a number of upcoming events in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and Seattle. On the APEC meetings and Women in Trade, we're hosting an event on Tuesday in Seattle. Members of Northern California will have exclusive virtual access. As part of our Seeking Truth Through Facts U.S.-China program series, we're doing an event on reporting on China. This will be a virtual program on August 28th. Japan Capitalism at Work, that will be on September 15th in San Francisco. Seattle members will have virtual access. The head of the Asian Development Bank will be with us on September 18th in San Francisco. We're doing an event on the Silicon Triangle, the US, Taiwan, China, and semiconductors. That's on September 26th in Silicon Valley. And we're going to talk about global trade with a focus on India. That's on October 10th in Silicon Valley. As a reminder, the APEC Leaders and CEO Summits are going to be hosted in San Francisco in November, so stay tuned for all of our events. And if you're not already a member, please join us. You're going to get access to all of these terrific programs. Thank you to our Asia Society team, Christy, Nina, Mon, Aaron, and our interns. Special thanks to Christy Young-Smith, who curated this program and recruited all of our speakers. We are deeply, deeply grateful again to all of our speakers. And on behalf of Asia Society, Northern California, and Seattle, thank you for joining us.